Thanks very much, Manuel. If we were meeting here 200 years ago, a group like this would probably be talking about the number one moral and human concern at the time, which was slavery. And in fact, Cambridge University was heavily involved in inspiring and indeed its graduates in leading the movement to abolish the slave trade. Thomas Clarkson won the Latin Prize essay in 1783 with his forceful arguments for reducing slavery. Then he submitted a report on the evidence about slavery to Parliament in the early 1790s. Wilberforce led the fight in Parliament, and the idea of a very broad social network coming together and being persistent over years. They failed, actually, to pass the law. They almost got through in the 1790s. They made some progress in 1807. Ultimately, the law wasn't passed until 1834, taking effect in 1838. Could we cut global violence in half on that kind of time frame? Well, there's a similar society that has been centered at Cambridge, in which we see a social movement developing, but not in the general society, within a vocation, a profession, potentially. One in which Alex Murray of West Midlands, who came to Cambridge for his part-time master's degree for police leaders, founded here in the 1990s under the leadership of my predecessor, Anthony Bottoms. Alex decided in 2010 to get some other graduates together and found the Society for Evidence-Based Policing, and served with distinction for 4 years. Scott Chilton of Hampshire Police has just taken over. Sarah Thornton of Thames Valley came back to finish her master's degree as a chief constable and has helped to spread it throughout her force. But the person I'll probably speak most about is Stephen Williams, who's the current head of the police in Trinidad and Tobago, one of the highest homicide societies in the world, and has been doing everything he can to try to cut violence by using evidence-based policing, which is a very basic idea I suggested in 1998 on the kind of problem-solving model developed by Kurt Lewin, using the best research and the best in-house data to constantly develop and test new guidelines, seeing whether they actually get delivered and if they produce the results that are desired, and if not, to keep trying constantly for something better. Since 2010, the Society for Evidence-Based Policing has attracted some 2,000 members, 500 of whom are in Australia. But now with 35 countries, I've enlarged the typeface for the countries with very high homicide rates, just to show you the sort of reach that we have. And the aims of this society, I think, are very similar to those of evidence-based medicine, as John Shepard has helped us to promote the connection. Increase the use of best available research evidence to solve policing problems. Produce more research by police practitioners and researchers. Communicate the research evidence to police practitioners and the public. And this is a very important development at a time in which not only Europe, but I think the whole developed world is increasingly subject to a contest between democracy and the rule of law, in which democracy keeps pushing for more external control of police on the evidence-free theory that more brute force of power to have democracy push the police around, most recently in the form of police and crime commissioners in this country, will somehow increase the punishment of police abuse, help us to demonize corruption and therefore get rid of it, as opposed to what we see in a much longer history, in a way, certainly in this country, where the Magna Carta is sometimes cited as the basis of democracy, when it's actually the basis of a rule of law, following some consistent rational legal principles under a Weberian typology of authority, in which the police, like the judiciary, could develop stronger internal controls, stronger public trust in their professional morality, and encourage those peer controls by praising good results when they occur. The evidence that I won't go into on a lot of the comparative analyses, Suzanne Karstadt, Manuel Eisner, and others here at this conference will say much more about, suggests that if the police can somehow create more legitimacy for their work, that there can be less violence in societies. Unraveling that correlation is sticky, but I think most of that research really treats police legitimacy as a dependent variable. And from a leadership development standpoint, our job, in which we spend 9 weeks a year in intense conversations with police leaders from around the world, is to ask them how can nations increase their police legitimacy, more specifically, how can police themselves increase their police legitimacy in ways that avoid the temptation to turn it into spin or cosmetics or optics, which essentially denies the fundamental issues like police killing citizens at very high rates, which they tend to do in societies with low police legitimacy, like Trinidad, which has a very high rate of police killings of citizens. And that tends to be common with high homicide rates. What I think we can go to for help and inspiration is the theory and evidence around self-legitimacy. If the police believe in the rightness of what they're doing themselves, that will help to improve their own peer control and to improve their capacity to serve the public interest, starting with police effectiveness in reducing violence. Because powerlessness corrupts, the police believe that they are powerless to reduce violence, which is commonly heard among the police. What can we do? It's in society. The police commissioner of New York, before two people who had a very different view, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, said, police have nothing to do with preventing homicide. It's entirely about society. Lee Brown actually had a doctorate in criminology. Maybe that's what he was taught at Berkeley. It's not what the evidence is that we look at here at Cambridge. The perceived efficacy of the police, having police believe that they have some capacity to reduce violence, was central to everything Bill Bratton did in trying to make the New York City police as effective as possible. Maybe other reasons led to a 75-80% decline in homicide. Read Frank Zimmering's book about the city that became safe. But I think nobody would discount entirely the complete transformation of the New York City Police Department's approach to focusing its resources on trying to reduce violence. And sadly, that was not accompanied by a larger view of legitimacy in which the quality of interaction with the public, communication of what the police have to do in order to serve their interest, the sort of disconnect between, again, brute force tactics, stop and search without politeness, led to a complete public revolt against all of that, even though it worked. So effectiveness is not enough. Understanding about procedural justice, which we certainly teach our police leaders studying here at Cambridge, has to be a part of it. But ultimately, there is much evidence, much hope that if we can get the police to think of themselves as capable of preventing violence, that it will give more meaning to their work, as Viktor Frankl suggests in his own reflections on a concentration camp that he lived in and survived in his book Man's Search for Meaning. I think police are suffering in high violent societies in a sense of hopelessness and despair, and that self-legitimacy may be the first step in transforming the police in high violent societies to do a better job. Why? Because police agencies are moral battlefields. Because honest cops are continuously fighting with the less honest cops, not just about corruption, but about killing people, tribal issues perhaps in Africa. We have rarely encountered a police agency, and there are some, which is uniformly committed to a kind of evil abuse of police powers for the sake of the police. And the idea that we have professional cops on William Kerr Muir's typology in his book Police Street Corner Politicians, we have professional cops always contending with the cynics to control the police culture, is connected to what we're seeing in terms of cultural tipping points in some police agencies, from despair to hope, from selfishness about why you're a policeman or police officer to the public interest to be served. As James McGregor Burns, who recently died, suggests in his notion that transformational leadership is about getting people to want to do something that is more important for an issue outside their own personal interests. With the transactional rewards of corruption perhaps in competition with that, but as I'll conclude in the end, I think the recent evidence that the most effective leadership is both transformational and transactional is further reason to think about how we can build police self-legitimacy through a global movement for evidence-based policing. It starts with this view that, yes, we can prevent crime, which is what Sir Robert Peel suggested in building the British police in 1829. He's given credit for Peel's principles. We think they were written by a Cambridge graduate named Sir Richard Mayne, who was the first police commissioner of the Met, serving 39 years. His co-commissioner died shortly after they started the police. So Mayne and his emphasis on the success of the police not being indicated by the visible punishment that they impose, making arrests, getting prosecutions, but by the absence of crime as the primary purpose of policing, created a whole new possibility for believing in the efficacy of police actions as a contribution to rational legal authority in the Weberian sense. Neither the traditional reliance on police experience, which one often hears in this century, nor charismatic response to the inspiration of a Bratton who liked to connect himself and his leadership style to General Patton in World War II. I think the emphasis on a professional understanding of what works is an important supplement to the emphasis on law alone. And so when you read Weber, it's important to see that it's not just legal authority, it's rational legal authority. And what's rational about the public interest test in English prosecution and arrest decisions is that we have to know that something's going to do some good. And going back 700 years, the main good is to prevent violence. So if punishment is going to provoke a clan feud and a lot of people are going to die, then don't go ahead and prosecute. Work for reconciliation, restorative justice. Magistrates knew that 400 years ago before lawyers got involved. You could say the advent of lawyers led to less rationality, but that's another issue. I'd like to stick with the police, where what I think we see is more confidence through evidence of success, especially that comes from randomized controlled trials and other modern techniques for showing cause and effect relationships between what the police are doing and how violence can be reduced. So to reinforce violence reduction, the evidence-based policing framework that we teach at Cambridge, and which Michael Tonry helped us to publish in the most read and cited criminal justice journal, Crime and Justice, which he edits, the 3 T's of targeting police resources on the selected targets where most of the harm is concentrated in this power few Pareto curve concentration that shows up with offenders and places and victims and so many other distributions. Then when you know where and with whom you want to target the resources, test what works best for whom, when, and then try to do that thing that works best on the basis that can be tracked. So you can find out whether or not it's actually happening. And which turns out to be both the oldest and the least systematic idea in policing, since police in London used to actually be punished if there was a crime on their beat. That got abandoned. But what New York still isn't doing, as far as I know, is what Trinidad is now doing, which is to use GPS devices to figure out where the cops are at every minute of the day and to see whether they're where they're supposed to be, which is where crimes are by far more likely to occur than other places. So let me give you 2 case studies of evidence-based policing at work. The first is homicide in Trinidad. The second is domestic abuse in the United Kingdom. Both issues are important for this conference's goal. One of them is typical of developing nations. The second is typical of all nations, including very developed nations. I'm going to tell you in both cases about the 3 T's. In Trinidad, we're going to talk about targeting the hotspots of homicides, small places where 80% of all the homicides occurred last year in Trinidad, testing the use of more patrol time in those places, and then tracking that time to try to drive up the patrol visits to the threshold level that seems to make the difference in reducing homicide. And without tracking, all of the tests in the world aren't going to make it happen. For domestic abuse, we'll look briefly at some preliminary evidence on targeting repeat dyads, testing a cognitive behavioral therapy approach using one-on-one counseling with abusers, and tracking it not with the conventional measures of how many repeat incidents, but with what's much more important to violence, which is how much injury, how much harm is associated with using the treatment or not. So first, Trinidad, you should understand that when Venezuela caught pneumonia, a lot of other countries caught a cold. Trinidad is one of them. That's one of the theories. Suzanne Karstadt's said a lot more about this that you may be interested in, why over the first decade of this century there was a fourfold increase in the homicide rate in Trinidad. But certainly we see in Trinidad the kind of evidence that you see many places in which citizens kind of turn off from police contact if they don't think the police are legitimate. And a key factor, as our colleague Justice Tankaby has shown, and increasing evidence suggests, if people don't trust the police to be able to prevent crime, they may be less likely to engage with the police, like reporting crimes. And that's what Stephen Mistrowski and his colleagues found in pretty systematic research in Trinidad. What we found when we first went into Trinidad, after they'd been sending their assistant and deputy commissioners to us for about 4 or 5 years, we asked them to plot by actually using paper reports the times of day when the patrols were going out. And we found that patrol peaked at 11:30 in the morning and came back up a bit around 10 o'clock. But the homicide was heavily concentrated between 6 p.m. and 2 a.m. And this is actually still our biggest battle. But the easiest battle to win was to identify the hotspots, to do the targeting, and then to design a study that would sidestep the key argument about hotspot policing, which is if you put the police here, the crime's just going to go there. And so there's no hope, right? It's all useless. We can't prevent anything, so we should just spend our time catching people. The conviction rate for homicide in Trinidad is 5% of the homicides. So even if they want to catch more people, the issues in evidence with terrorized witnesses and so forth are enormous. But what we decided to do for the first time, and there's been about 30 hotspots policing experiments, but they've all been hotspot based as the unit of analysis. And we thought we could sidestep the displacement argument, which we have to a certain extent, by saying, look, the entire police district is going to have more cops at every hotspot. And so if they want to go someplace else, they're going to have to go to an entirely different police district where they might get killed by the criminals before they have any trouble with the police. And so what we did as of last September 1st for 90 days was to randomly assign one member of 20 pairs in a sample of 40 stations to either have increased GPS-measured minutes of patrol in the hotspots, which could then become the basis of a national policy, which we've been trying to roll out since the first of this year. All divisions and districts are compared weekly by the commissioner and by the division commanders going right down, based on a method that we like to call COPSTAT on the right, because the officers doing the patrol, which is being measured and which is being criticized for not being enough in the right places at the right time, are the ones who have to come in every 2 weeks and talk about why they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. So it's much more involvement, it's much more direct feedback than the New York City model, in which all the generals come together and sit around like the United Nations and talk about what those tens of thousands of cops are doing out in the street. But the ones who are doing the work never come in and have the discussion about it. They don't participate in the interaction ritual. They don't acquire a sense of meaning about their success or failure because they're totally left out of the picture. So when we do this, it's a form of tracking in the 3 Ts, in which there's a 30-minute discussion with the station commander every 2 weeks. And they look at the data, they look at the maps, they discuss what they need to do a better job. And the experiment failed because the GPS broke down and we couldn't actually measure how much patrol they did in the hotspots in the experimental or control group. It only failed in that respect. We know that the control group did not have any maps, did not have any other ways of trying to imitate the treatment group. We know because there was random assignment, similar levels of violent crime, and no capacity for the control group to be contaminated with this random assignment, and looking at even, shall we say, placebo data, because we were convinced at the time that these bar graphs showing the 4 different police patrol teams in each station were giving accurate readings of how much more or less patrol that they were doing. It turns out it was wrong, but like the Hawthorne effect, giving them these data every 2 weeks seemed to concentrate their minds wonderfully, because a lot of people kept coming up to them and saying, how can we see so many more police patrols than we ever did before? The problem was that they weren't going to the hotspots, at least by these corrupt data at the time, and the percentage of their time, the ratio of their time in and out of the hotspots remained very poor. What they were persuaded by were these one map snapshots of a patrol on a single night. And in this particular case, we don't have the hotspots, but we know that they never once touched a hotspot during the entire course of the patrol. And they accepted that as valid. This is what the hotspots look like. This is Laventille, which is the highest homicide area in Trinidad, where the police actually patrol with soldiers. And the security ministers just bought an armored car, which the police don't want to use. But it shows you how small these areas are and how much they need to know exactly the boundaries in order to be inside them for the geofence to register the presence of the police car. Anyway, whatever we did, it worked. 41% reduction in homicide across the 20 stations that were given the hotspot maps and told to do more patrolling, and relentlessly bothered about it every 2 weeks, compared to the controls. And the logic of that is that there were exactly 71 murders or shooting, wounding cases in each of the two groups in the 3 months prior to the experiment beginning. Then during the experiment in the treatment group, it dropped to 56, and in the control it rose to 95. So there was a 40% less level in the experimental group than in the controls. This is what it looked like quarter by quarter in the run-up to the experiment. You can see the groups are very similar until the randomly assigned intervention occurs. Then we see a big gap. And if you look across a forest graph of the 20 pairs, what you see is something that's not uncommon in medical treatments, which on average help patients. You may also know that there's lots of patients for whom various drugs that work on average don't work for that patient. What we got was 10 station pairs where there was an effect bigger than a Cohen's d of 0.1 or 0.1 of a standard deviation improvement. 5 of them actually got worse, but only one of those was significant. These were the 10 effect size. Just scanning down the left-hand side, you can see the biggest effect size was 0.42 of standard deviation to 0.17 at the bottom. What that left us with was the desire to roll this out right away, but we had a kind of interim period in trying to kickstart it because of these GPS issues. And the technical providers of it just kept running into problem after problem. Meanwhile, homicide soared nationwide. Despite the continued lower level in the control areas across the whole country, in the first month of the year, there was about a tripling of the homicide rate over the year before in that month. In the first quarter, it was about 50% higher. I'm happy to say that as we've actually gotten the program implemented, today it's dropped to 5% increase over this time last year. We may even wind up with the year lower than 2013, but it's all consistent with how the program's being rolled out. This is what happened until we really got the GPS straight, and even the area where we'd reduced it came back up as residual deterrence curves usually show. By the middle of the year, we had Northern Division, led by a current Cambridge student whose master's thesis draft is in my briefcase, and he had lots of reasons to make this work. He was getting his people up to the mid-70s, 70 minutes per day per hotspot. Now that actually was the level in the original hotspots experiment in Minneapolis, done in the late 1980s, about 75 minutes per day per hotspot compared to less than half of that in the control group. But his was the only one, and the others, there were a few that were two that were above 40, and then the others were just way down there. And in a minute, I'll show you how that related to the increase in homicide. But the good news is, as of the week ending 14 September, this Sunday, The whole country, the whole target zone for homicide across those 8 divisions is out up to 50 minutes per day per hotspot. The Northern Division is still way up there at the far left after actually having a wobble the week before. Each of these colors is the 3 weeks ending until this Sunday, so that you can see that a relentless focus on this stuff every week with the commissioner doesn't let poor leaders like one of these I won't point to, but somebody whose body language, everything else, just he doesn't want to hear about it. This is not important to him. He's going to get his pension no matter if the homicide rate doubles or triples, and he could care less. So everything we heard in the preceding presentation applies across these 8 leaders. But the 9th leader is the guy chairing the discussion, who is now pounding at this, which is how we looked earlier in the year, and we're getting it up to somewhat higher levels in the peak homicide times, but it's still not enough different to correspond to the difference in risk. The evidence from the rollout so far shows that where a threshold of 40 minutes per day per hotspot is hit, there's been a 20% reduction in homicide over the year before in those divisions, compared to a 68% increase where they didn't manage to get the program implemented. If you go down to the district level, the reduction in homicides, 18% among the 7 stations that have hit the 40-minute threshold on the left, and an increase in homicide of 43% in the other 38 stations with under 40 minutes. But 5 minutes, thank you. If we look at what Stephen Williams is doing as a leader, he is just spending at least 3 hours a week with the 8 division commanders who are sitting there as peers, some of them with shame, or at least potentially shame, others with pride, but he's trying to puncture the pride as well, because it's not good enough, and it's not enough in the high crime times, and there's constant need for improvement, which he just won't let go of. And that's a kind of different story from Sarah Thornton, who has simply tried to spread evidence-based policing among her thousands of officers who've never been to Cambridge, never read anything about it. But in a one-day event, one of her officers, who was about to roll out a 100,000-pound program for domestic violence with 100 people, came up to Heather Strang and said, "Could we do this as a randomized trial?" And that led to a conversation in which 180 eligible people were perfectly randomly assigned and perfectly treated as assigned, with 90 getting this one-on-one cognitive behavioral therapy counseling and the other 90 not. If we use the standard count method, what we found was that there was a 10% non-significant reduction in repeat calls by the police, which a lot of people care a lot about because it's costly. But it wasn't statistically significant, therefore nobody would give it any credit. It would seem to be not cost effective. But if you look at the crime harm index, which Cambridge is promoting as the currency of violence reduction, of harm reduction generally, by taking the number of days sentencing, which Peter Nehrud, our colleague helping to develop the index, knows about because he was a member of the Sentencing Council. And its initial first step gives a number of days that can become the currency for how serious the crime is. It was a 96% reduction in crime seriousness with this cognitive behavioral therapy. And it came because there was a rape, there was a GBH, grievous bodily harm, a near-death kind of injury, actual bodily harm with treatable medical problems. 13 of those in the control group compared to only 4 in the treatment group, and 23 assaults, common assaults, no visible injury, compared to 14. So even if you take out the rape and grievous bodily harm, the 2 at the top, which added over 1,000 days each to the crime harm index, you still had a 65% reduction in the crime harm index from this treatment. This is preliminary, but it could be consistent with another experiment in Hampshire, which is working with less serious cases. We may find that cognitive behavioral therapy is a breakthrough for treating domestic violence. and the police are the ones who can get them into the treatment, which means that ultimately we ought to pay the police more so that we can drive down violence, because wherever the police are paid more, generally, not in India, but most places where they're paid more, there tends to be less violence. What's chicken and what's the egg? I don't know. I think we need a narrative of that the police are capable of preventing violence, but that in itself comes back to the evidence. And ultimately, what we can see is the social movement creating a virtuous circle whereby police not only try to reduce violence because they want to, but because they'll get paid more. And the more successful they are, the more they get paid, and the less we suffer from harm, which seems to be where we're heading in this conference. We have to keep the balance and proportion of ethics and not think that the police can do it alone, but nor should we think that the courts and prisons can do it alone. The only claim here is that we're much better off with a police that believes they can make a difference and that uses the scientific method to figure out when they do and when they don't. Done.